name is Ethan, and for 34 years, I have lived in these mountains. Not visited, not passed through, lived. My entire existence has been bound to the ancient forests and hollows of West Virginia, where my family has roots that go back generations, where my father taught me to read the land like most people read books, where I learned that the mountains keep secrets far older and far more dangerous than anything documented in textbooks or official records. At 22, I joined the Forest Ranger Service. I was idealistic then, believing that my role was to protect the wilderness and help those who ventured into it. 12 years later, I understand that protection works both ways. The forest protects itself, and I have learned that some encounters are not meant to be investigated, documented, or reported through official channels. On an October night that I can no longer forget, I was conducting a routine patrol near Rome Mountain. The season was transitioning from autumn into something colder and more hostile. The leaves had turned to shades of rust and copper, and the air carried that particular chill that comes from the mountains, knowing winter approaches. I was familiar with every trail in my designated area, had walked these paths hundreds of times, and felt no sense of dread as I began my evening rounds. The sky was clear that night. Stars were visible through the tree canopy, and a 3/4 moon provided enough light to navigate without my flashlight. I prefer the darkness on these patrols. The animals move differently when they do not feel the intrusion of bright light, and I can observe them in their natural state. That preference would change forever by the end of that evening. I was approximately 4 miles into my route when I heard it. The sound came from deep within the forest, from the direction of a ravine I knew well but rarely ventured into. It was not quite a scream, not quite an animal cry. It existed somewhere between human vocalizations and the sounds made by creatures that have no need for human language. The sound contained something that triggered a response in my nervous system that I had never experienced before. My hand moved to the bear spray on my belt. My heartbeat accelerated. Every instinct developed over 34 years of mountain living told me something was profoundly wrong. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence returned to the forest, but it was not the silence I knew. This was an active silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I made the decision to follow the sound. I tell people now that this was foolish, and they are correct. But in that moment, I believed my training and experience would see me through. I was a ranger. I was equipped. I was competent. I did not understand yet that competence means nothing when you encounter something that operates outside the rules of nature as we understand them. I moved toward the ravine, carefully, my hand still resting on the bear spray. The deeper I moved into the forest, the stronger a smell became. It was the smell of decay, ancient and pervasive, mixed with something metallic that I would later recognize as blood, old blood, blood that had been exposed to the elements for an extended period. The smell was overwhelming enough that I had to breathe through my mouth to avoid gagging. When I reached the ravine, the smell intensified tenfold. The moon was still visible through the tree canopy, and by its light, I could see what lay before me. At first, my mind could not process what I was seeing. The ravine contained what could only be described as a den. Branches had been arranged in an intricate pattern, creating structures that resembled shelter. Animal hides, dozens of them, had been stretched and arranged along the den walls. But among the hides were other materials, strips of fabric, pieces of clothing, items that were unmistakably human in origin. And on the ground, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate organization, were bones. Animal bones, yes, but also something else. A femur too large to be from any animal native to these mountains. A skull, partially intact, with a row of teeth that did not belong to any creature I could identify. I stepped closer, moving into the den. Every rational thought told me to retreat, to report what I had found, to let proper authorities investigate. but I was paralyzed by the need to understand what I was looking at. The bones had been arranged with a precision that suggested intelligence. Strips of fabric had been woven between the bones in patterns that appeared almost ritualistic. Among the collection, I found objects that sent ice through my veins. Photographs. Old photographs, their edges worn and corners bent from handling. The images showed people I did not recognize. Some appeared to be from decades past, judging by the clothing and condition of the photographs. Others were newer. One photograph showed a family of 4 standing in front of a hiking cabin. The cabin had a date written on the back in faded ink. 1992, 30 years ago. The family in the photograph was smiling. They appeared to be on vacation, unaware that their images would end up in a collection of bones and cloth in a ravine 15 miles from the nearest town. As I stood in the den, processing what I was seeing, I became aware that I was no longer alone. It was not a sound that alerted me. It was a feeling, a pressure in the air, a change in the quality of the silence that had returned to the forest. I turned slowly, my hand now firmly gripping the bear spray. At the edge of the moonlight that penetrated into the ravine, I saw movement. A figure. Bipedal, definitely. But the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long. The posture was too collapsed, as if the figure was hunched forward in a way that no human posture would allow. In the moonlight, I could make out what might have been a face, but the features were obscured by hair or fur or something else that covered the figure completely. What struck me most forcefully was the smell. The smell emanating from this figure was the same smell that filled the den, magnified 1,000-fold. The smell of decay and blood and something ancient and wrong. I did not wait for the figure to approach. I did not attempt to communicate. I did not take photographs or make notes. I ran. I abandoned all pretense of composure and ranger protocol and ran through the forest toward the trail I had come from, crashing through undergrowth and ignoring the branches that cut at my face and arms. Behind me, I heard movement. The figure was following me, but not with the urgency I expected. It moved through the forest with fluid grace, as if the terrain presented no obstacles. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs threatened to collapse, until I reached my vehicle at the ranger station parking area. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes with the doors locked and the engine running, unable to process what I had experienced. When my hands finally stopped shaking enough to operate the radio, I called it in. The response was swift and official. Within an hour, backup rangers arrived. I reported what I had found and described the figure I had seen. The details sounded absurd as I spoke them aloud, but the den itself was real. We could smell it from half a mile away. The backup rangers conducted a preliminary investigation while I remained at the station. They were professional and thorough. Evidence was collected, photographs were taken, the bones were cataloged. For 3 days there was activity. Investigation teams came. Forensic specialists arrived. County sheriff personnel conducted interviews. I provided all the details I could remember. I described the den, the arrangement of the bones, the photographs, the figure I had seen. Then, on the 4th day, everything stopped. The investigation was officially closed. I was told the remains were animal bones, likely arranged by bears or other wildlife scavenging the area. The photographs were deemed artifacts left by hikers and had no bearing on the case. The figure I had seen was probably a large animal, possibly a bear standing on hind legs, which can appear disturbingly humanoid in dim light. My report was filed. The evidence was stored in an evidence locker, and life returned to normal. Except nothing was normal anymore. What changed was more than my perception of the forest I had lived in my entire life. 2 weeks after the investigation was closed, I encountered one of the investigating officers at a store in the nearest town. His name was Frank, and I had known him for years. When he saw me, his expression shifted. He pulled me aside and told me quietly that I should not speak publicly about what I had found. He said there were matters at play that went beyond my understanding or pay grade. He said there had been disappearances in the area going back decades. all officially attributed to hiking accidents or people becoming lost in the mountains. He said the photographs I had seen were not isolated incidents. He said people at higher levels of authority were aware of what existed in these mountains. He said the only reason I was alive was because I had run. He said others who had investigated further had not been as fortunate, and then he walked away. I continued working as a ranger for 3 more years. During that time, 3 other rangers were assigned to patrol the area near Rome Mountain. Within 6 months, one of them disappeared. The investigation concluded he had become lost during a hiking accident and died of exposure. His body was found 2 miles from my den, but the cause of death was attributed to hypothermia and falls. The second ranger requested a transfer after reporting strange sounds and evidence of surveillance near Rome Mountain. The third ranger lasted 1 month before quitting the service entirely and moving to another state. None of us ever spoke about what we suspected. I left the ranger service 5 years ago. I told people it was time for a different chapter in my life, that I wanted to explore other opportunities. The truth is that I became increasingly unable to ignore what I knew about the mountains I had lived in my entire life. Every time I patrolled certain areas, I felt watched. Every time I heard unusual sounds in the forest, my body would seize with the same paralyzing fear I had experienced that October night. I realized that I was no longer comfortable in a place I had once considered home. I still live in West Virginia, but in a town surrounded by other people, in a place where the forest cannot reach me at night. I know this makes me a coward. I know I abandoned a duty to investigate further, to uncover the truth, to protect others who might encounter what I encountered. But I also know that some truths are hidden deliberately. Some mysteries are left unsolved for reasons that transcend any individual ranger or any official investigation. And I know that there are still sounds in those mountains at night. Sounds that I can no longer hear from where I live, but sounds that I know exist nonetheless. Sometimes, in the deep part of night, when sleep abandons me, I think about the figure I saw in the ravine. I think about those photographs. I think about the bones arranged in their meticulous patterns. And I think about the warning Frank gave me about others who had investigated further. I often wonder if any of those rangers are still alive. I often wonder if they learned what those mountains truly contain. And I often wonder if I made the right choice by running, or if I simply delayed an inevitable reckoning. The mountains still wait, and they have a very long memory. My father passed away 17 years ago, and I did not understand the significance of his death until 5 years after he was already gone. That realization came gradually, pieced together from conversations with my mother, journal entries I found in his belongings, and a story he had told me only once when I was a teenager, a story I had largely forgotten until I discovered the evidence he had left behind. My father's name was Nettie, and he was a hunter. Not a recreational hunter who went out for a few weeks during deer season. A serious hunter. A man who knew the mountains and forests of West Virginia with the kind of intimate knowledge that only comes from decades of living off the land, from tracking animals through snow and mud, from reading sign in ways that most modern people could never comprehend. My father was 72 when he died of a heart attack. My mother always said it was the stress of the mountains that killed him, though I did not understand what she meant until much later. I am 67 years old now, and I have spent my life wondering about the story my father told me when I was 16. I did not take him seriously at the time. I was a teenager, more interested in my own life than in the cryptic warnings my father seemed determined to impart. He took me into the forest on a cold November day and told me that some places in the mountains were not meant for human exploration, that certain areas had been inhabited long before our families arrived, and that the things living in those deep places had no interest in sharing the land with modern civilization. When I asked him what he meant, he simply said that I would understand when I was older, and that I should avoid the ravines near Fenwick Mountain, and cranberry glades no matter what I saw or heard. He made me promise. I promised because my father was a man who did not make requests lightly, but I did not truly comprehend what I was promising to avoid. Years passed. I became an adult. I pursued my own interests and mostly forgot the strange warning my father had given me. It was not until after his death, when I was going through his belongings with my mother, that I found the journals. My father had kept detailed records spanning 40 years. Most of the journals documented hunting expeditions, weather patterns, and the movement of animals through the mountains. But scattered throughout the entries, particularly in the earlier journals, were references to something else. References to sounds he had heard near cranberry glades. References to structures he had found deep in the forest that could not have been made by animals. References to experiences that had changed his perspective on what existed in these mountains. And in the final journal, dated to the year before his heart attack, a detailed account of an encounter he had experienced 50 years earlier when he was a young man of 22. My father wrote that he had been hunting near Fenwick Mountain on a November evening much like the one when he had given me that cryptic warning. He was tracking a deer when he noticed unusual markings on the trees. Not claw marks or antler scrapes, but deliberate carved marks that seemed to create a pattern. The marks led him deeper into the forest, away from the area he normally hunted, toward a ravine he had never explored before. His curiosity overrode his caution, and he followed the marked trail. What he discovered in that ravine would haunt him for the rest of his life. He found a pit, approximately 12 feet deep and 20 feet across, dug deliberately into the earth. The walls of the pit were lined with animal skins and hides, arranged in careful patterns. Among the hides and skins were bones, hundreds of bones, some from animals he could identify and others from creatures he could not. But it was not the bones that truly disturbed him. It was the collection of objects arranged deliberately at the center of the pit. My father described in meticulous detail finding human clothing, decades old by the appearance of it, scattered among the bones. He described finding jewelry, watches, and personal items that suggested human habitation or human presence. And he described finding what he called a doll, but this was not a toy made by human hands for entertainment purposes. This object was constructed from twigs bound together with what my father believed to be human hair. The figure was deliberately shaped in the form of a human body, and at the center of the torso, a small cavity had been carved and filled with what appeared to be human fingernails arranged in a deliberate pattern. My father wrote that as he stood at the edge of the pit, examining these disturbing artifacts, he heard a sound. The same sound that would chase him out of the mountains for decades. It was a crying sound, he wrote, but not the crying of any human infant. It was something that mimicked the sound of a distressed baby, but carried undertones that suggested something far older and far more calculated. The sound came from deep within the forest, echoing through the ravine. My father wrote that every instinct demanded he investigate the source of the sound, that something about the cry was designed to draw him deeper into the forest. But another part of his mind recognized the danger and overrode his curiosity. He began to climb out of the pit. As he climbed, he heard the sound again, but this time it came from ahead of him, from the direction of the trail that would lead him back to his starting point. The crying sounded closer. My father described writing in his journal that he realized with absolute clarity that the sound was blocking his primary exit route. He changed direction, choosing to climb the opposite wall of the ravine, moving away from the marked trail that had led him to this place. The forest was becoming dark. Twilight was transitioning into night. My father ran, navigating by instinct and desperation rather than by any deliberate knowledge of the terrain. He ran until his lungs burned. He ran until his legs threatened to collapse. He ran until he reached a ranger station where he stumbled out onto a road, soaked in sweat despite the cold November night. Unable to articulate clearly what had driven him into such a state of panic, The ranger who found him called for a search and rescue team. My father was treated for hypothermia and exhaustion. When questioned, he could not provide a coherent account of what had happened. He remembered the ravine. He remembered the pit. He remembered the collection of objects, the bones, the doll constructed from twigs and human hair. But he could not locate the exact position of the ravine on any map. Search teams were sent out, but they found nothing matching his description. The pit, the hides, the bones, the doll, the marked trees that had guided him into the forest, all of it had vanished, or was deliberately hidden. My father spent 6 months in the mountains before abandoning his life there entirely. He moved to a different state. He tried to rebuild his life away from these mountains. But the memories haunted him. 20 years passed before my father returned to West Virginia. He came back slowly, cautiously, choosing to live in a town rather than deep in the forest, as his family had for generations. He resumed hunting eventually, but he stayed within specific areas, avoiding the regions near Fenwick Mountain and Cranberry Glades entirely. He married my mother during this time. They had me. They built a life together. But my father remained vigilant. He remained aware, and he watched the mountains constantly, as if waiting for something to emerge from the depths of the forest. 5 years after my father died, I made a decision that would have infuriated him had he been alive. I decided to search for the ravine. I was 47 years old enough to understand the seriousness of what my father had experienced, but young enough to believe that perhaps time had changed things. Perhaps I could find evidence of what he had encountered. I took my father's journals with me. I studied the descriptions he had provided. I cross-referenced them with topographical maps. I narrowed the search area to the region between Fenwick Mountain and Cranberry Glades, and I began to explore. It took me 6 months of searching, but I eventually found it. The ravine was overgrown, less accessible than it had been when my father found it 50 years earlier, but the pit was still there. The arrangement of hides along the walls had been replaced and renewed, suggesting ongoing habitation. The bones had been collected and reorganized, suggesting deliberate curation of the collection. And at the center of the pit, arranged exactly as my father had described it in his journal, was the doll. The doll had been maintained meticulously. The twigs were bound fresh. The human hair was still intact, though how long it had been there was impossible to determine. And the cavity at the center of the torso still contained fingernails, though whether they were the same fingernails my father had seen 50 years earlier or new ones was something I could not discern. I photographed everything. I collected samples. I documented the precise location using GPS technology that my father had never had access to. I was going to bring evidence to authorities. I was going to prove that what my father had experienced was real. I was going to solve a mystery that had haunted my family for 2 generations. But as I prepared to leave the ravine, I heard something. It was the same sound my father had heard 50 years earlier. The crying of something that should not exist. It came from deeper within the forest, echoing through the ravine in the way that sound carries through tight spaces. And I made the same choice my father had made. I ran. I did not run with the panic my father had experienced. I ran with the clear understanding that I was no longer alone in that ravine, and that whatever inhabited this place had allowed me to see what I had seen. The crying continued as I ran, sometimes from behind me and sometimes from ahead of me, as if the entity controlling the sound was testing whether I would run toward it or away from it. When I reached the edge of the ravine, I did not stop running until I reached my vehicle. I drove out of the mountains at excessive speed. I arrived at a hospital in a nearby town claiming to have been exposed to contaminated material in the forest. I had them examine the samples I had collected. The results came back inconclusive. The bone fragments were indeterminate. The hair samples matched no known animal species. The officials were confused and ultimately uninterested. I destroyed the photographs. I deleted the GPS coordinates. I buried the samples. And I have never returned to that ravine. My mother died 7 years ago. and when I collected her belongings, I found letters my father had written to her, letters he had never mailed. In one of them, dated to the year before he died, he wrote that he understood now why certain places were forbidden. He wrote that some men get left out in the wild too long. They forget who they are. They become something else. They make places in the earth and wait for others to find them. They collect things. They create museums of their existence. And they test the people who venture into their territory to see if they are worth keeping or if they should be allowed to escape. I kept that letter. I have read it thousands of times. Every time I read it, I understand a little more deeply what my father experienced and what I experienced. The things my father warned me about are still in those mountains. The ravine is still there. The pit is still maintained. The doll is still preserved. And whatever cries in the deep forest near Fenwick Mountain and Cranberry Glades is still waiting for the next person curious enough or foolish enough to venture into its territory. I have tried to tell people this story, but most do not believe it. They think I am engaging in folklore or exaggerating family legends. But I know what I saw. I know what my father saw, and I know that some places in these mountains should remain unexplored. Some mysteries should remain unsolved. Some warnings should be heeded without question. My father understood this truth, and it killed him anyway. His heart simply gave out from the weight of knowing. I met Carter 7 years ago at an outdoor education conference in North Carolina. He was presenting on wilderness survival techniques, and I was there to share curriculum resources for teaching environmental education to high school students. We talked for hours after his presentation ended, discovering that we shared not only a passion for the mountains, but also a similar philosophy about how to teach young people to respect the natural world. 6 months later, we began dating. 2 years after that, we decided to combine our professional interests and personal relationship by creating a hiking documentary series. We wanted to showcase the beauty of the Appalachian Trail while telling stories of the people who inhabited the regions through which the trail passes. We had completed 3 successful documentary projects when we made the decision that would forever change our understanding of what exists in these mountains. We decided to hike a remote 20-mile section of the Appalachian Trail that runs between the Virginia and West Virginia border. This section is not particularly popular with through hikers because the terrain is challenging, the shelters are spaced far apart, and cell service is virtually non-existent. We saw it as an opportunity to capture genuine footage of the wilderness without crowds or interference. Carter is an experienced hiker with 15 years of backcountry experience. I've been hiking seriously for 10 years. We were both confident in our abilities. We had proper equipment, plenty of food and water, and detailed maps. We told friends where we were going and when we expected to return. We did everything right. What we did not account for was an encounter that no amount of preparation could have equipped us to handle. We began our hike early on a Saturday morning in late September. The weather was perfect. The autumn colors were just beginning to emerge. We established a comfortable pace, planning to hike approximately 8 miles the first day and camp at one of the established trail shelters. As we hiked, I was recording video on my phone, capturing the landscape and commentary that we would later edit into our documentary. Carter was navigating using his GPS device and topographical maps. We were completely focused on our project, barely noticing the subtle changes in the forest around us until we encountered the women. They appeared suddenly on the trail ahead of us, perhaps 100 meters in the distance. At first, we thought they were fellow hikers, but as we drew closer, we realized something was distinctly wrong with their appearance and behavior. There were 4 women, all appearing to be in their 30s or 40s, all dressed identically in white clothing that was filthy and stained with dirt and what appeared to be dried blood. They were walking in perfect synchronization, moving with an unnatural coordination that suggested they were being controlled by something external to themselves. Their expressions were vacant. Their eyes were open, but appeared to be focused on something infinitely distant. Most disturbing was the way they moved. There was no natural rhythm to their gait. They walked as if each step was being dictated by an external force. Carter and I exchanged a look of concern. We slowed our pace, allowing the women to move further ahead of us before we continued. But something about the situation felt deeply wrong. We began to discuss quietly whether we should attempt to help them, whether they were lost or injured or in some kind of medical distress. Before we could reach a decision, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Behind the women, maintaining a distance of approximately 50 meters, were two men. These men were moving parallel to the trail, not walking on the actual path, but rather moving through the dense forest with surprising ease. They were watching the women, observing them. When one of the women began to slow down, one of the men stepped closer and said something in a low voice. The woman immediately increased her pace, returning to the perfect synchronization with the other three women. I grabbed Carter's arm and pointed toward the men. He saw them immediately and understood the implication. These were not lost hikers in need of assistance. This was something far more sinister. We made the decision to hide and observe rather than reveal our presence or attempt to help. We moved off the trail quickly and quietly, concealing ourselves behind a thick cluster of rhododendron bushes. From our vantage point, we could see the women and their handlers clearly. Carter took out his phone and began recording video. I watched through my camera lens as the procession passed within 30 meters of our hiding place. What I witnessed over the next 30 minutes fundamentally altered my perception of what is possible in these mountains. The men with the women were not forcibly restraining them with weapons or physical force, yet the women were clearly captive. They moved when directed. They stopped when directed. They made no attempt to flee or cry for help. But the most disturbing element was the organization of it all. This was not a random abduction. This was a coordinated operation involving multiple people, executed with military precision, suggesting planning and practice. The men communicated with each other through subtle hand signals. The women were guided along a specific route that diverged from the main Appalachian trail, leading deeper into the forest and away from any established hiking paths. Once the procession had moved far enough away that we felt safe doing so, Carter and I emerged from our hiding place and began following them, maintaining a careful distance. We knew we should return to the trail and report what we had seen to the appropriate authorities, but we were also aware that official channels might not believe our account without additional evidence. We had video documentation of the women and the men, but we needed to understand more about what we had witnessed. We followed them for approximately 2 hours as they moved deeper into the forest. At one point, the women were herded into what appeared to be a natural ravine that had been deliberately modified to create a concealed enclosure. We observed from a distance as the men brought food and water to the women. The women ate and drank mechanically, without any apparent awareness of what they were consuming. As we were preparing to retreat and contact authorities, a fifth woman suddenly emerged from the dense undergrowth near our position. Unlike the other 4 women, this woman was clearly conscious and aware. She was covered in mud and blood. Her clothing was torn. Her eyes were wide with terror and desperation. She was crawling through the forest, attempting to move silently, heading in a direction away from the enclosure. Without hesitation, we moved toward her. Carter checked her for injuries while I asked her what had happened. She was so traumatized that her responses were fragmented and difficult to piece together. She told us her name was Sarah. She said she had been captured approximately 1 week earlier while hiking alone. She said she had been kept in an underground structure with other women. She said she had been drugged repeatedly. She said the men had done things to her that she could not articulate without breaking down completely. She told us that she realized she was pregnant when they performed a medical examination on her. She said they became angry when they discovered this. She said they tried to force her to terminate the pregnancy. When she refused, they beat her. She said she managed to escape during a moment when her captors were distracted. She'd been fleeing through the forest for what she thought was one day, but might have been longer, because she had been sedated, and her perception of time was distorted. She had no idea where she was. She did not know how many people were involved in the operation. She only knew that she had been part of a larger group of women, and that the organization suggested something systematic and ongoing. Carter told her that we would get her to safety. We helped her stand, though she was weak and disoriented. We began moving back toward the trail as quickly as safely possible, supporting her between us. But as we moved, we began to hear sounds from the direction of the enclosure. The handlers had discovered her escape. We could hear voices calling out, not in concern but in anger. We could hear movement through the forest, organized and systematic. Carter grabbed Sarah's hand and we began to move faster. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. We ran, abandoning caution in favor of speed. The final stretch to the trail was frantic and desperate. We could hear the men behind us. We could hear Sarah's labored breathing and sobs of fear. When we reached the trail, we did not slow down. We ran toward the nearest trail shelter, approximately 2 miles away. When we finally reached the shelter, we found another hiker, a man in his 60s who was startled to see us emerge from the forest in such a state of panic. We explained the situation as clearly as we could. He immediately radioed for help on his satellite communicator. Within 6 hours, rescue personnel arrived. They took Sarah to a hospital. They took her statement. They conducted initial investigations. What happened next involved law enforcement, hospital staff, and official bureaucracy. Sarah's medical examination confirmed she had been recently assaulted and was approximately 1 month pregnant. Authorities conducted searches of the forest region where we had encountered the handlers. They interviewed us extensively. They reviewed the video footage Carter had recorded. For approximately 1 week, there was genuine investigation and urgency. Then, just as in so many cases described in these mountains, the investigation stalled. Sarah disappeared from the hospital. I cannot say she was taken. She was simply no longer there one morning. Her medical records went missing. The official investigation was closed without explanation. The authorities told us that there was insufficient evidence to pursue charges, and that the area where we believed the enclosure was located did not, according to any official records, exist. We attempted to continue our investigation independently. We attempted to contact Sarah through every means available. We reached out to missing persons organizations. We filed reports with state police and FBI field offices. We were met with bureaucratic resistance at every turn. People stopped responding to our calls. Doors that had been open suddenly became closed, and we received anonymously a package containing screenshots of video footage we had recorded. The footage was sent from a device we could not trace. The message was clear. Someone was watching us. Someone knew what we had seen and done. Someone was sending us a message that our continued investigation would have consequences. Carter and I stopped pursuing the matter. We abandoned the documentary project. We both left our jobs in outdoor education. We moved away from the mountains, though I can no longer explain exactly why we felt that was necessary without sounding paranoid. But we know what we saw. We know what we documented. And we know that there is something organized and systematic happening in these mountains, something that operates with enough influence to shut down official investigations and suppress evidence. Sometimes I think about Sarah. I wonder if she escaped into a different life, or if she became part of the systematic operation. I wonder how many other women are part of this system, and I wonder if we made the right choice by leaving when we did. Because as I think about it now, I realize we were being evaluated that day. We passed, so they let us go, but I do not know if they will always be so merciful if we return. I've worked for the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources for 15 years. I started as a junior ranger at 27 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in forestry and a genuine desire to protect the wilderness I grew up in. Over the years, I was promoted through the ranks, eventually becoming head ranger for a state park that encompasses approximately 30,000 acres of protected forest land in eastern West Virginia. I manage a staff of 12 rangers, coordinate search and rescue operations, and oversee the daily management and maintenance of trails, shelters, and facilities. It is a position I have always taken seriously. The rangers under my supervision are my responsibility. When something happens to them, it is my failure as a leader. Approximately 3 years ago, I began noticing a pattern that would consume my professional attention for the next 18 months. The first indicator was subtle. A junior ranger named Liam requested a transfer to a different park. He claimed the work was fine, the pay was acceptable, but he had developed an anxiety about the deep forest areas of my park. He said that certain locations triggered irrational fear responses in him. He could not explain why. He only knew that when he was assigned to patrol specific trail systems, he experienced overwhelming dread. I accommodated his transfer without questioning it extensively. People react differently to work environments, and I attributed his request to personality or temperament issues. 3 months later, another junior ranger, Mitchell, disappeared during what should have been a routine overnight patrol. He was a responsible ranger with 3 years of experience. He had checked in via radio at 7 in the evening, reporting he was securing a trail shelter for the night. He never checked in again. Search and rescue teams mobilized immediately. We searched that forest for 5 days using every resource available. We found his vehicle, his equipment, his camping gear, everything in perfect order at the trailhead. But we found no trace of Mitchell himself. Eventually, the official investigation concluded that Mitchell had gotten lost or injured and likely died of exposure in the forest. His body was never recovered. Officially, the case was closed as a hiking accident. What disturbed me was the location where Mitchell had been assigned that night. It was an area I would later recognize as highly significant. The location was near a section of forest that had limited trail development, significant elevation changes, and dense canopy coverage. It was not a particularly dangerous area, but it was remote. I thought about that location long after the investigation concluded. I thought about why Mitchell had been assigned there. I thought about whether the assignment was random or deliberate. 4 months after Mitchell disappeared, a third junior ranger named Harper requested a transfer. Like Liam, Harper reported experiencing severe anxiety in certain forest areas. Unlike Liam, Harper was more specific about which locations triggered the response. She identified 3 specific trail systems that made her physically ill when she attempted to patrol them. All 3 trail systems connected to the same remote forest region, where Mitchell had been sent the night he disappeared. Harper was transferred, and I was left with the undeniable recognition that something systematic was occurring. I began my unofficial investigation by accessing employment records for the past 5 years. I discovered that 7 rangers had requested transfers, retired early, or left the department entirely. Almost all of them had cited reasons related to anxiety, fear, or unspecified psychological distress. Several of them had served in my park. More significantly, I discovered a pattern in the patrol assignments for the rangers who had left. They had all been assigned to the same geographic region, the same collection of remote trail systems. The assignments appeared random on the surface, distributed across multiple rangers, scheduled throughout the year, but someone reviewing the data could detect the pattern if they knew what to look for. I began researching the history of my park. I reviewed decades of incident reports, employee records, and any documentation related to unusual occurrences. I discovered references to missing hikers dating back 40 years. The cases were scattered throughout the records, some labeled as hiking accidents, others attributed to people becoming lost and dying of exposure or falls. No single incident appeared extraordinary, but collectively, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Approximately 1 to 2 hikers per year went missing in my park. The disappearances did not cluster in any particular season. They occurred year-round. They occurred in different locations throughout the park, but they all seemed to cluster around the same remote forest region that Liam, Harper, and Mitchell had identified. I became obsessed with understanding what was in that forest. I began assigning myself to personal patrols in the region. I hiked those trails extensively, searching for any evidence of unusual structures, unusual signs, or anything that might explain why the area seemed to trigger such powerful fear responses in my rangers. I found nothing concrete, but I did find something else. I found evidence that someone, or something, was actively observing the trails. I found places where brush had been deliberately arranged to create vantage points overlooking established hiking routes. I found equipment caches that did not match any official park infrastructure. I found markers carved into trees that seemed deliberately obscured, visible only if you were specifically looking for them. I reported my findings to my supervisor, a man named Director Foster, who oversaw multiple state parks across the region. I presented my theories about the pattern of disappearances and the pattern of ranger anxiety. I presented documentation of the geographic clustering of missing persons cases. I presented evidence of the observation structures I had discovered. Director Foster listened to my presentation with increasing discomfort. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he told me something that changed everything. He told me that what I was investigating had been known about for decades. He told me that rangers throughout the state park system had reported similar patterns. He told me that there had been investigations by state police, county sheriffs, and even FBI field offices. He told me that every investigation had eventually stalled. He told me that people at levels above his had concluded that certain areas of these mountains were not worth investigating further. He told me that if I continued pursuing this line of inquiry, my career would suffer consequences. He told me to stop investigating immediately and to redirect my attention to routine park management. I did not listen. I continued my investigation independently, carefully documenting everything without creating an official record that could be used against me. I interviewed the rangers who had transferred or retired. Their stories were remarkably consistent. They reported feeling watched in certain areas. They reported hearing sounds that did not match any known animal in the region. They reported experiencing what could only be described as psychological manipulation, subtle cues, and signals that made them aware they were being observed and evaluated. One ranger, a man named Reeves, told me something that particularly disturbed me. He said that in the final week before his transfer, someone had left a note in his locker. The note contained a specific quote from a conversation he had had with his family in his private apartment, a conversation that should have been impossible for anyone outside the apartment to have heard. The implication was clear. Someone in that forest region was not just observing the rangers. Someone was actively surveilling them in their personal lives. Someone had the capability to gather information about private conversations and use that information to send psychological messages of intimidation. I became convinced that an organized group was operating in that forest region, an organized group with specific knowledge of ranger assignments, specific knowledge of my park's infrastructure, and specific knowledge of which rangers to target for psychological pressure. The group seemed to be selectively harvesting hikers while simultaneously driving away park personnel who might become problematic. It was calculated. It was systematic. It was ongoing. I made the critical mistake of attempting to investigate further on my own. I assembled a team of rangers I trusted and organized an expedition into the most remote sections of the forest region. We were searching for any physical evidence of encampments, structures, or other proof of organized presence, we found something. We found the remains of what appeared to be a deliberately concealed dwelling area. We found evidence of occupation. We found personal items belonging to several of the missing hikers, items that confirmed our theory that this was indeed where people had been taken. I was photographing the evidence when I received a radio call from Director Foster. He informed me that I was to stop all operations immediately and return to the park headquarters. I complied, assuming that my investigation had been officially discovered. When I arrived at headquarters, Foster was there, along with two men I did not recognize. They identified themselves as federal law enforcement, though they did not specify which agency. They informed me that I had stumbled into an active federal investigation, that I was to cease all personal investigations immediately, that I was to retain no copies of any photographs or documentation I had gathered, and that I was to speak to no one about what I had discovered. I attempted to argue that public safety was at risk, that hikers were disappearing, that something systematic needed to be addressed through proper channels. They listened politely and then repeated their directive. They told me that the situation was being handled at levels above mine. They told me that my continued curiosity would result in professional consequences. They told me to go back to managing my park and forget what I had discovered. I complied. I destroyed my documentation. I ceased my investigation. I reassigned my rangers away from the problematic forest regions entirely, a move that was never questioned because it made administrative sense. I have spent the past 3 years managing my park, maintaining routine operations, and deliberately not thinking about what exists in those remote forest areas. But I know the truth. I know that an organized presence exists in these mountains. I know that it has been operating for decades. I know that authorities at levels above my director are aware of it and have chosen to tolerate it or manage it quietly rather than confront it. And I know that if I had pressed further, if I had refused to accept the federal directive, I would likely have disappeared just like the hikers. So I keep silent. I file my reports. I manage my rangers away from danger. And I accept that some areas of these mountains are beyond the reach of law, beyond the protection of government, and beyond the realm of official investigation. That acceptance might make me complicit, but it also keeps me alive. I work as a GPS technician for a telecommunications company that specializes in satellite infrastructure and positioning systems. My job involves traveling to remote locations throughout Appalachia to install, calibrate, and maintain GPS receivers and related equipment. The work is solitary most of the time. I spend my days in forests and on hilltops working with sophisticated technology in places that often have no cell service, no human contact, and no infrastructure beyond the natural terrain. I have been doing this work for 12 years. I'm meticulous about my job. I follow protocols. I document everything. I maintain equipment with precision. And I have never, in 12 years, encountered a situation that could not be explained by logical technical troubleshooting. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when my GPS unit failed in a way that should have been impossible. I was driving through eastern Kentucky, moving from one installation site to another. My destination was approximately 40 miles away. The route I was following was well established, documented on every mapping system I had access to, and relatively straightforward. I was driving through rural mountains, along roads that ranged from paved county highways to gravel Forest Service roads. Approximately halfway to my destination, my GPS unit lost all satellite signal. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Forests in these mountains sometimes create dead zones where the canopy is so dense that satellite signal cannot penetrate. I switched to my backup GPS unit. That unit also showed zero signal. I pulled over to check my equipment. Both units appeared to be functioning correctly. Their internal diagnostics indicated no hardware issues, but both units were showing the same anomalous readings. They were displaying coordinates that placed me on a location that did not appear on any of my mapping software. The coordinates were consistently impossible. They placed me approximately 15 miles south of my actual location, and in a geographic position that, according to every map I could access, was in the middle of a continuous forest with no roads, no structures, and no reason for any roads to exist. I drove forward, assuming the GPS systems were experiencing temporary interference. I would recalibrate them once I passed through the dead zone. However, as I drove, the landscape began to change in subtle ways. The road I was following seemed to deteriorate more than the typical degradation I expected. Trees seemed to close in tighter. The forest became denser. And then I noticed something that made me pull over. The road I was following was not on my map, not on any of my maps. I consulted my physical paper maps, my phone mapping applications, my vehicle's original factory navigation system. None of them showed this road. None of them showed this location. I decided to stop trying to navigate by external systems and simply drive back the way I came. I turned the vehicle around, but as I drove back, something became clear. The landscape did not match my recollection of the route I had just traveled. The trees were arranged differently. The curves in the road were in unexpected locations. After 15 minutes of driving, I recognized that I was lost. Genuinely lost. In a landscape that seemed deliberately designed to prevent navigation, with roads that seemed to shift and change as I drove. I attempted to use my cell phone to call for help. No signal. I attempted to reach the telecommunications company office on my CB radio. No response. My GPS units continued showing coordinates that placed me in impossible locations. I drove forward blindly, following roads that existed but did not appear on any mapping system I possessed. And then I came upon the holler. It emerged from the forest suddenly, as if the dense woods simply stopped and opened into a valley that should not have existed. But the holler was clearly inhabited. I could see structures through the trees. Multiple buildings, all of them partially hidden by undergrowth and deliberate camouflage. The structures appeared old, built from natural materials, and arranged with no apparent regard for any building codes or municipal planning standards. I could see people moving between the buildings. They wore clothing that appeared decades out of date. They moved with a sluggishness that suggested either great age or profound exhaustion, or something else I could not identify. I drove slowly through the holler, my heart rate accelerating with every second. The people I saw did not react to my vehicle. They simply continued their activities with complete indifference to my presence. I saw a woman hanging clothing on a line constructed between two trees. I saw a man carrying what appeared to be a freshly killed deer. I saw children, pale and thin, moving between structures, with a slowness that matched the movements of the adults. Nobody acknowledged my presence. Nobody looked at me. It was as if my vehicle, moving through their space, was invisible to them. As I drove deeper into the holler, I became aware of something else. The buildings contained artifacts. Visible through windows and open doorways were objects that seemed impossible to explain. Photographs covered the interior walls of several structures, hundreds of photographs tacked up and arranged in patterns. I could not see clearly from my vehicle, but the photographs appeared to show people, many people, arranged in groups. And then I saw something that compelled me to stop. Mounted on the exterior wall of one of the larger buildings were items that looked disturbingly like highway signs. Actual traffic signs, the kind that mark routes and distances. Multiple signs, all of them pointing in different directions, all of them bearing route numbers and destination names. But the destination names were not real places. They were locations that did not exist on any map, coordinates to nowhere, directions to impossible places. I drove through that holler as quickly as I dared without driving completely recklessly. As I emerged on the other side, the forest closed in again. The dense woods returned. And when I looked in my mirror, the holler had disappeared behind me. Within minutes of driving away from it, I could no longer see the structures or the people or any evidence of habitation. The holler had vanished. When I finally reached a location where my cell phone picked up signal, I immediately called my office. I reported the GPS equipment failures. I reported being lost. I asked for assistance triangulating my location. Using cell phone tower signals, my office was able to determine my actual position. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, approximately 3 miles from my scheduled destination. My vehicle had never deviated from the expected route. That was impossible. I had driven for 40 minutes in directions that did not match any mapped roads. I had entered a holler that I could describe in detail. I had seen people, buildings, signs, evidence of habitation. But according to every external source of information available, I had driven in a straight line along an established road without ever deviating or getting lost. I completed my scheduled installation and drove home. The next day, I contacted the county mapping office in the area where I'd gotten lost. I provided them with a description of the holler, the location where I believed it to be, and the specific coordinates my GPS had shown before the signal became impossibly inconsistent. The county official I spoke with became quiet when I described the location. He asked me to repeat the coordinates. He asked me to describe the landscape more specifically. And then he told me something that made my skin cold. He said that several years earlier, a hiker had reported finding a holler in that same general area that did not appear on any official maps. The hiker had reported seeing structures and people. The hiker had reported strange signage pointing to non-existent locations. The hiker had reported that when he tried to photograph evidence, his camera malfunctioned and all photographs were corrupted. The hiker had reported the location to authorities, but when searches were conducted, no evidence of the holler or any structures could be found. The county official told me that the hiker's report was in an old file, largely forgotten because it had seemed unreliable and the searches had found nothing. But he said that my detailed description matched the hiker's account so precisely that he did not believe in coincidence. I drove back to that location 1 week later. I attempted to locate the holler again. I drove down the same road, looking for the landscape changes that would indicate the location where I had become lost, but I could not find it. I drove that route 3 more times over the course of 2 months. Each time I was looking for something that I knew I had experienced, but that every logical system insisted could not exist. During my last attempt to find the holler, I noticed something that terrified me. A package was sitting on the seat of my vehicle when I returned from my day of searching. Nobody had entered my vehicle. It was locked, but the package was there. Inside the package were photographs. Dozens of photographs. Photographs of me. Photographs taken from angles that made clear I was being watched. Photographs of me driving. Photographs of me at gas stations. Photographs of me at my apartment. Photographs of me at my office. Recent photographs. Some taken within days of receiving the package. The photographs were accompanied by a note. The note contained the license plate number of my vehicle, my home address, and a single sentence. The sentence said simply, "You found the way in. You know not to find it again." I no longer drive through eastern Kentucky. I have requested transfer to a different service region. I have not driven down that particular road again. I have not attempted to locate the holler. And I do not know if the holler is actually a place that can be located or if it exists in some space between mapping systems, visible only to those who become lost in the right way at the right time. What I do know is that someone or something in that holler now knows exactly who I am and where I live. That knowledge exists whether the holler itself is real or imaginary. That knowledge is permanent, and the message was clear. Certain places do not want to be found. Certain routes do not want to be mapped, and certain people do not want witnesses to their existence. I made the logical choice by stopping my search. But I made it not because I believed the logical explanation, but because I received photographic evidence that I was being surveilled by something that existed beyond the reach of any mapping system or technological device I possessed. And I understood that the only way to remain safe was to accept the impossible and move on. Inheritance is supposed to be a blessing. It represents something passed down through generations, something valuable that carries both material worth and emotional significance. When my uncle died 5 years ago, he left me approximately 30 acres of land in West Virginia that had belonged to my family since the 1800s. The property included the original homestead structure, several outbuildings, and a substantial tract of forest that extended across a ridge and down into a narrow valley. My uncle had been a historian, obsessed with documenting our family history. He left behind extensive journals, photographs, and property documents that traced our family legacy back 7 generations. I inherited not just land, but also the responsibility of preserving that legacy. I am 54 years old now. I have a successful career in business. I have a wife, 2 adult children, and a comfortable life in Charleston. I did not have immediate plans to do anything with the inherited property. I considered it an investment, something I would maintain until my own children were old enough to decide what they wanted to do with it. But approximately 6 months after taking ownership, I traveled to the property to assess its condition. That assessment changed my understanding of what my family had inherited and what we had been protecting or perhaps contained for generations. The property was in poor condition. Years of neglect had taken their toll on the structures. The old homestead needed significant work. The outbuildings were partially collapsed. The land itself had been reclaimed by forest in many areas. I hired a work crew to begin clearing the property, removing fallen trees, and assessing structural integrity of the buildings. It was during this clearing process that we discovered something unexpected. Beneath decades of accumulated leaves and forest debris were structures that predated the original homestead. When we began excavating around the oldest homestead structure, we found foundations of previous buildings arranged in patterns that suggested habitation predating the established family history. We found stonework that appeared to be from the 1700s, or possibly earlier. We found tools and fragments of pottery that did not match the material culture I expected from the early colonial Appalachian settlers. As I continued the investigation, I decided to review the journals my uncle had left me with fresh attention. Perhaps he had documented something relevant to these earlier structures. I found references. Scattered throughout decades of my uncle's journals were cryptic entries mentioning the deeper history, the older people, and the ones who never came down. My uncle wrote about encounters his great-grandfather had described, encounters with people in the mountains who had not come down to the settlements, who resisted incorporation into the colonial system, who maintained their own independent existence deep in the forest. My uncle had apparently spent significant time researching this history. He had compiled notes about historical records that mentioned conflicts between settlers and what were sometimes referred to as wild people or mountain people, who seemed to maintain a separate existence in the deepest forest areas. These references appeared sporadically in colonial documents, militia reports, and private journals from settlers. They described organized resistance to encroachment, systematic theft of livestock and supplies, and most disturbingly, evidence of intentional predation on isolated settlers. My uncle had apparently conducted his own investigation of this family history. He had explored the property extensively and documented his discoveries in his journals. The final entries, written approximately 1 year before his death, described what he believed to be evidence of an ongoing organized presence in the deepest sections of his property. He wrote about discovering structures that were not part of the official family history, structures that appeared to be much older than the homestead, structures that suggested occupation by people who maintained deliberate separation from the settled world. I was reading these passages when I heard a sound coming from the forest. It was dusk. The work crew had left for the day. I was alone on the property, sitting on the porch of the old homestead, reading my uncle's journals. The sound came from the forest edge, approximately 100 meters away. It was not the sound of an animal. It was the sound of something large, moving deliberately through the undergrowth, coming from the direction of the valley, where my uncle had noted the most significant discoveries. I went inside the homestead and locked the door. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the sound was likely a deer or a large animal disturbed by the day's work activities. But that night, I did not sleep. I listened to sounds coming from the forest, sounds that seemed too organized to be natural animal movement. I heard what might have been voices, though they were too distant to understand any content. I heard what might have been tools striking stone or metal. Over the next several weeks, as I continued work on the property, disturbing events accumulated. Equipment would disappear from the work site during the night and reappear in different locations. Tools would be moved without explanation. The work crew reported feeling watched while working in specific areas of the property. 2 of the workers refused to return after their second day, claiming they had seen figures in the forest watching them. They described the figures as appearing human, but moving with an unsettling gait and coordination. I decided to investigate personally. I hired a surveyor to map the property completely and identify any structures or ground anomalies that might indicate previous habitation. The surveyor's work revealed something significant. In the valley below the homestead, hidden by dense undergrowth and deliberate camouflage, were the remains of multiple structures arranged in organized patterns. They were old. The surveyor estimated they were perhaps 100 to 200 years old, but they were also obviously intentional. These were not natural formations or accidental archaeological features. These were deliberate buildings arranged with purpose. I explored the valley carefully, bringing with me detailed notes from my uncle's journals and his hand-drawn maps of locations he had investigated. In the valley, I discovered what appeared to be burial sites, multiple graves marked by stones arranged in patterns. I found evidence of food storage systems, structures that suggested deliberate planning and organization of resources. I found indicators of livestock pens, though they appeared designed to contain creatures rather than typical farm animals. Most disturbing was what I found near a large stone outcropping at the valley's deepest point. There were photographs, dozens of them, tacked to a stone wall, protected from weather by an overhang. The photographs were old, dating back apparently decades, but they were preserved with obvious care. The photographs showed people, large groups of people, arranged in formal groupings, the way families arrange themselves for formal portraits. The people in the photographs appeared pale, with hair and clothing that seemed from another era. And there were children, many children, all of them appearing similarly physically and arranged in the same family groupings across different photographs, suggesting successive generations. But what made my blood run cold was a series of more recent photographs, possibly taken within the last 10 years. These photographs showed the property. They showed the homestead. They showed the work crew. They showed me. These were surveillance photographs. Someone living in that valley had been documenting everything that happened on my property. Someone had been watching the work crew. Someone had been watching me. I removed the photographs and returned to the homestead. I called my family and told them about the discoveries. I reported the situation to county authorities. I provided them with the photographs, the evidence of structures, and my uncle's journals. The response was initially official and professional. Authorities visited the property. They explored the valley. They examined the structures and grave sites. Then the investigation simply stopped. I received a visit from two men who identified themselves as representing federal authorities. They informed me that the property and its history were part of an ongoing investigation that could not be discussed. They collected all documentation, including my uncle's journals and the photographs I had provided. They informed me that I was to cease all activity on the property beyond basic maintenance. They informed me that I was to speak to no one about what I had discovered. I complied. I closed the work site. I abandoned the restoration of the property. I left the structures as they were, and I resigned myself to uncertainty about what exactly my family had inherited and what exactly had existed on that land for generations. But the situation did not end there. Approximately 1 month after the federal officials' visit, I began experiencing equipment malfunctions at my home in Charleston. My security cameras would malfunction mysteriously. My door locks would be tampered with in ways that left no evidence of forced entry. At one point, I discovered that every photograph in my home had been removed from frames and replaced with surveillance photographs of myself and my family. The message was unmistakable. I increased home security. I consulted with the FBI field office directly, expressing concern about potential threats. I was told that I was likely being paranoid and that my property issues were probably just standard criminal activity, but I knew better. I knew that whatever lived in that valley, whatever my family had been containing or managed through generations of careful distance, knew where I lived, knew my family, knew my children. I stopped investigating. I stopped asking questions. I stopped reviewing my uncle's journals, though I kept them stored in a secure location. My uncle's interest in uncovering the full history of what our family property contained apparently cost him his health and eventually his life. His heart attack, officially attributed to natural causes, happened 2 weeks after he had written his final journal entry, describing his discovery of the surveillance photographs his ancestors had apparently been the subject of. I now maintain the property at a distance. I pay property taxes. I keep the structures from collapsing completely, but I do not return to the property if I can avoid it. I do not encourage my children to visit, and I certainly do not attempt to develop or investigate further. My family has apparently been living adjacent to something organized and intentional for generations. My ancestors managed this proximity through calculated distance and selective ignorance. I have come to understand that this was not incompetence or negligence. It was survival strategy. What lives in that valley or elsewhere on the property has apparently chosen to tolerate our family's existence as long as we do not interfere. My uncle tested that tolerance through investigation and historical research. The message that followed was clear. My family tried to drive them out a century ago. They are still here, and they have not forgotten. I have been a nursing home director for 23 years. I started my career as a nurse, worked in hospital settings for 12 years, and eventually transitioned into administration because I wanted to be in a position to affect systemic change in long-term care facilities. I have worked in 3 different facilities over the past 11 years, and my current position has been my most rewarding and my most heartbreaking. I manage a 72-bed facility in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia, a facility called Ridge Haven that serves primarily elderly residents with limited financial resources or family support. Many of my residents are what we call legacy residents, people who came to us decades ago and have never left, people who have spent the last years of their lives in my facility because they have nowhere else to go. I grew up in this region. I have family connections here. I understand the culture and the poverty and the particular challenges of providing quality care in rural Appalachia. I accepted this position because I believed I could make a real difference in the lives of vulnerable elderly people. What I did not understand was that I would become the director of a facility that was actively being preyed upon by something that the official systems of protection and oversight were either unwilling or unable to stop. The first incident occurred approximately 3 years ago. One of our residents, a man named Harold, who had been with us for 17 years and had no family, wandered away from the facility during night shift. This was not particularly unusual. Harold had moderate dementia and had attempted to leave the building several times before. Our night staff had protocols for searching the grounds and contacting local authorities. Harold was discovered the next morning by a jogger approximately 2 miles from the facility, deceased. The official cause of death was attributed to exposure and probably a fall that he had sustained while confused and wandering in the dark. What troubled me was the condition of Harold's body. He was wearing clothing that did not match what he had on when he disappeared. His pajamas were in his room, and he was wearing street clothes that I did not recognize. His shoes were placed neatly at the edge of the woods, approximately 100 meters from where his body was found, as if he had removed them deliberately and walked barefoot into the forest in sub-freezing temperatures. The coroner, however, assured me that the official cause of death was consistent with a wandering elderly man becoming lost and exposed to the elements. 6 months later, a woman named Dorothy disappeared. She had been a resident for 19 years and had no living family members. Like Harold, Dorothy had mild to moderate dementia, but she was not a wanderer. Dorothy was relatively content in the facility and did not exhibit the kind of agitation that might drive her to attempt escape. Staff reported that in the hours before her disappearance, Dorothy had mentioned hearing voices outside her window, voices that seemed to be calling her name. By the time staff responded, Dorothy had left her room and accessed a door that was supposed to be locked. She was gone. Despite extensive searches, Dorothy was never found. Then, 3 months after Dorothy disappeared, another resident, a man named Chester, disappeared under similar circumstances. He had been at Ridge Haven for 13 years. He had no family. He had recently been expressing confusion about where he was and seemed to be experiencing some cognitive decline. The night shift reported he had been sitting at the window of his room, seeming to stare at something outside. By morning, he was gone. Again, searches found nothing. Again, the incident was attributed to a wandering elderly person becoming lost in the forest. I became suspicious. I reviewed all reports from the past 5 years. I searched for patterns. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. In addition to the 3 disappearances, there had been 7 other incidents of residents attempting to leave the facility during night hours. Residents who reported being called by voices outside their windows. Residents who seemed drawn to the doors and attempting to escape. In all 7 cases, staff had intervened and prevented the residents from leaving the facility. In 4 of those cases, the residents had been unable or unwilling to explain why they had suddenly felt compelled to leave. In 3 cases, they described hearing what sounded like family members calling them from outside, voices that seemed impossible given that those family members had passed away years ago. I called a staff meeting. I asked specifically about the incidents and whether anything else had been unusual. A night shift nurse named Ava mentioned something she had been hesitant to bring up in formal reports. She said that on multiple occasions when she was outside the building checking on outdoor maintenance issues or taking breaks, she had seen figures moving through the woods adjacent to the facility. She described them as appearing humanoid, but moving with an unusual gait and coordination. She said they seemed to be watching the building. She said they concentrated their attention on specific windows, particularly windows of rooms where residents had subsequently attempted to leave. I installed security cameras on the exterior of the building, focusing on the areas where Ava had reported seeing figures. I increased the security presence during night shifts. I physically checked door locks and window mechanisms. I implemented protocols to identify residents who might be particularly vulnerable to being drawn outside. And then I observed something on the security footage that changed everything. The footage from the exterior cameras showed clear evidence of organized activity. Multiple figures, appearing humanoid, but moving, with an unsettling coordination, would approach specific windows during night hours. The figures would position themselves outside the window and seem to be signaling or communicating with whoever was inside the room. In one particularly disturbing sequence, I watched as a figure pressed its face against the glass of a window where a resident was sleeping. The figure remained there for approximately 3 minutes, and then the resident inside the window suddenly woke up and seemed to be responding to the figure, though of course no sound was audible on the video. I reported this to local law enforcement. I provided them with the security footage. I explained my theory that elderly residents were being deliberately lured from the facility by unknown individuals. The police response was initial investigation followed by a dismissal of my concerns. They suggested that the figures were probably just local teenagers playing pranks, that the residents were likely having hallucinations related to dementia, and that my interpretation of the security footage was probably affected by my anxiety about the disappearances. But I knew what I had seen. I knew that something organized was happening. I knew that something was deliberately targeting vulnerable residents, and I knew that my facility was being used as a collecting point, as a place where individuals came to select which residents to take. I increased security measures dramatically. I hired additional night staff. I locked down exterior doors with systems that required key cards to open. I installed motion sensors on all perimeter windows, and I began keeping detailed logs of any unusual activity or any resident behavior that seemed out of the ordinary. For approximately 2 months, the incident stopped. The figures disappeared from the security footage. No residents reported hearing voices. Everything returned to what I could call normal for a nursing home. Then, on a Thursday night, I received an emergency call at my home. A resident named Sarah had gotten out of her room and had somehow disabled the emergency alarm on an exterior door. By the time staff realized what was happening, Sarah was already outside. When they found her approximately 30 minutes later, she was being led away from the facility by what staff described as a person wearing dark clothing. The staff member who witnessed this, a young man named Daniel, said the figure had turned and looked directly at him when he called out. Daniel said the figure had stopped for a moment, seeming to evaluate whether to take Sarah or retreat. The figure eventually retreated back into the woods, and Sarah was recovered safely. What Sarah reported when questioned was fragmented and difficult to process. She said she had heard her late daughter calling to her. She said the voice seemed to be coming from outside her window. She said when she left the building, the figure she saw was not her daughter, but something else, something that was wearing her daughter's voice like a garment. She said she had walked with the figure because she was confused, but as they got further from the building, she became more aware that something was wrong. The figure had never spoken with Sarah's daughter's voice after they left the building. The voice had changed into something else, something that did not use human language. I made the decision to stop investigating independently. I realized that what I was facing operated with enough sophistication and organization that my attempts to protect residents were only resulting in escalating confrontations. I increased security but redirected my focus from investigation to prevention. I kept exterior doors locked at all times. I increased surveillance. I implemented protocols specifically designed to identify residents who might be targeted and to provide them with enhanced monitoring. The disappearances ceased. The figures stopped appearing on surveillance footage. But this did not feel like a victory. It felt like a negotiation, like I had set boundaries, and whatever was operating in those woods had recognized that my facility was no longer easy prey and had moved its attention elsewhere. I discovered through conversations with other nursing home directors in the region that I was not alone. Multiple facilities reported similar patterns. Residents disappearing from facilities in remote areas. residents reporting hearing voices calling them, incidents concentrated in nursing homes where residents had limited family involvement, minimal outside visitors, and little advocacy to investigate their disappearances thoroughly. The pattern was systematic. The selection process was calculated, and the operation was ongoing. When I reported this pattern to state health officials and federal authorities, I was met with the same dismissal I had experienced with local law enforcement. I was told I was experiencing professional stress. I was told I was being paranoid. I was told that elderly residents with dementia naturally wander and die in the forest. I was told to stop making unfounded accusations that might damage my facility's reputation. I stopped reporting. I focused on doing my job, which now means protecting my residents by keeping them secured within the building during night hours, understanding that once a nursing home on the ridge in Appalachia becomes known as a place where vulnerable people are taken, those running that facility become complicit simply by continuing to operate. I have been director of Ridge Haven for 6 years. In that time, 4 residents have disappeared. I have no proof that anything other than natural wandering and exposure caused their deaths. But I know the truth. And I know that my responsibility now extends only to the residents I can protect during the hours they are in my facility. After dark, in these mountains, there are forces at work that transcend any standard protocol or regulatory framework. My job is to keep the doors locked and to understand that this is not a failure of my security system. It is a successful negotiation with something that would prefer not to leave evidence of its activity during business hours. Ridge Haven continues to operate. Disappearances resume immediately if I were to close. And so I maintain security and accept the arrangement that exists between this facility and whatever exists in the woods. That acceptance might make me complicit, but it keeps my remaining residents alive. My name is Harper, and I am a content creator who specializes in outdoor documentary production. I have been making hiking and wilderness exploration videos for YouTube for the past 8 years, building an audience of approximately 200,000 subscribers who follow my channel for authentic documentation of remote hiking experiences throughout North America. I work with Daniels, who is my audio engineer and camera technician. We have been collaborating professionally for 6 years, and personally for 7. We started this documentary series because we genuinely believed there was value in capturing real wilderness experiences without the sensationalism or manufactured drama that characterizes most outdoor content. We wanted to document the authentic experience of hiking in remote Appalachia, capturing the sounds and visuals that other creators ignored in favor of dramatic angles and carefully edited narratives. That commitment to authenticity is what saved our lives. It is also what put them in danger. We decided to film a documentary focused on a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in Tennessee and Kentucky, a section that receives minimal traffic and offers genuine wilderness experiences. We spent 2 weeks hiking and filming, camping in established trail shelters, documenting the landscape, and recording audio that we would later use to create an immersive hiking experience for viewers. Our plan was to file a 13-part video series showcasing the different sections of the trail we covered, with each video focusing on specific landscape features, wildlife encounters, and historical information about the region. Approximately 4 days into our expedition, we encountered someone we described in our documentation as a local guide. He appeared on the trail ahead of us, a man in his 50s or 60s dressed in worn hiking clothes and carrying what appeared to be a handmade walking stick. He greeted us warmly and asked what we were doing in this particular section of the trail. We explained that we were creating a documentary about the hiking experience. He immediately offered to guide us to locations that he claimed would provide spectacular footage that most hikers never discovered. He described hidden overlooks, ancient structures, and scenic locations that were deliberately avoided by most trail guides because they were off the established route. I was immediately cautious. Daniels, who tends to be more trusting, was intrigued by the offer of access to unique locations. We discussed it and decided that having a local guide would indeed provide valuable content, and we had proper equipment, hiking experience, and safety protocols in place. We accepted his offer. The guide introduced himself as someone who had spent his entire life hiking these mountains and who frequently served as an informal guide for hikers who wanted to experience something beyond the standard trail. Over the course of the next 2 days, our guide took us to locations that were indeed spectacular. We filmed gorgeous overlooks, discovered remnants of old settlements, and captured audio of natural soundscapes that were genuinely beautiful and useful for our project. The guide was knowledgeable and friendly. He shared stories about the mountains, about wildlife, about the history of the region. He asked us detailed questions about where we were from, whether anyone knew our hiking route, what our plans were after we finished the documentary, and whether we had family members who would look for us if we went missing. That last question is when I realized something was wrong. I was recording audio on my phone at that moment, capturing ambient sound for our project, and I deliberately continued recording as the question was asked. I turned to Daniels and saw that he had also recognized the shift in tone. Our guide had asked the question casually, almost conversationally, but the implication was unmistakable. He was assessing whether we were viable candidates for something. The question was not innocent. It was evaluative. I suggested to our guide that we should return to the established trail, that we were running behind schedule and needed to meet our filming timeline. He did not object, but as we began hiking back, I noticed something disturbing. The route we were taking was not the route we had used to reach the overlook. We were being deliberately led into different terrain, toward areas that were progressively more remote. I mentioned this to our guide, suggesting that I thought we had come a different direction. He corrected me, insisting this was the way we had come, but I knew it was not. At that point, I made a decision that almost certainly saved our lives. I pretended to become panicked about being lost. I raised my voice, expressed concern about our location, and suggested we should stop and consult our GPS and maps immediately. This sudden display of agitation seemed to trigger something in the guide. He stopped walking. His demeanor changed. He was suddenly less interested in guiding us. He suggested somewhat coldly that we should return to the main trail, and he provided brief directions before excusing himself and disappearing back into the forest. The entire shift happened in a matter of seconds, and his behavior suggested that he had been evaluating us and determined that we were not going to behave as expected or be easy to manipulate. Daniels and I made it back to the established trail safely, and we immediately gathered our equipment and began hiking toward the nearest trail shelter, where we had planned to camp that night. But during the hike, I realized that I had been recording audio the entire time we were with the guide. I had been recording on my phone, capturing his voice, his questions, his directional attempts. I had documented evidence of what was happening. That night, in the trail shelter, we reviewed the audio and discussed what we had experienced. We both came to the same conclusion. This man was not a legitimate guide. He was someone who was deliberately selecting hikers to target. He was assessing whether we were vulnerable, whether we had family or friends who would report us missing, whether we would be cooperative or would fight back. His behavioral shift when I displayed panic suggested that easy victims were his preference. Resistant or unpredictable targets were less valuable. We were grateful to have triggered that evaluation and passed the test by being too complicated to handle. We continued our documentary project, but we altered our approach. We avoided any off-trail locations. We stayed within established hiking infrastructure. We remained vigilant and aware. And we continued recording because I had decided that documenting evidence was our best protection against what we had encountered. 3 days later, As we were hiking to our next filming location, we encountered the same guide again. This time, he was not alone. There were 3 other men with him, all appearing to be approximately his age, all wearing similar worn hiking clothes and carrying handmade walking sticks.